Welcome, everybody. I am Rupert Reed, co-director of the Climate Majority Project. Welcome to this joint webinar between republicEn and the CMP. What's going to happen this evening is I'm going to introduce the event for a few minutes, talking about why the CMP was so keen to have this event, basically. Then our main speaker is Bob Inglis, who some of you may know from the years of living dangerously, former Republican congressman who has a very terrible and tragic story to tell about climate denial in the Republican Party, but has a very positive story to tell about climate action going forward. And it's a fantastic pleasure to have him with us here this evening. He will be responded to by Amber Rudd, who many of you will be aware of as former UK Home Secretary and also Climate Change Minister, and who has, I think it's fair to say, become even more concerned about these issues in recent years since leaving her post. It's also a real delight to have Amber with us here this evening. Liam Kavanagh, my co-director, will make some short remarks in response to them. There'll be a little time for interchange between us four, although probably less than we would have liked. And then we will go to general Q&A and discussion, as is our norm in these CMP webinars. So let me make my introductory remarks about why we wanted to have this event. So the Climate Majority Project, the clue is in the name. We believe that without the mobilization of the climate majority, there is no hope of getting sufficient climate action. So how do we achieve that mobilization, and who is to take part in it? The answer to that question obviously has to include that it's going to be people way beyond what we might call the bubble of usual climate suspects. So for us, it has been a no-brainer since the start that we wanted to reach out to and include unusual suspects, people who might not fit the obvious profile of your climate activist or climate concerned person. Of course, in the personages of the people we have tonight, we have people who are from a background that some may not associate with climate action, but who have demonstrated very, very clearly their credentials in this space in the past. And one way of seeing why, in our view, it is so absolutely critical that they are welcomed with open arms into any dimension of this space is by reframing the way in which the conversation around diversity and inclusion takes place in our society today. So we're very used to including people on the grounds such as gender and race, but there is a serious risk, therefore, that we neglect other really important categories. For example, political beliefs. If we include men and women equally, but systematically exclude, say, conservatives from a space, our view in the Climate Majority Project is that that space is not genuinely inclusive. Somewhat similarly, if we are going to succeed in mobilizing a climate majority, it is absolutely critical that we are not endlessly divided among ourselves. So in the CMP, we see a profound need to depolarize the climate space and indeed depolarize political debate in general and make it possible for it to be more civil, for people to have disagreements, including major disagreements about things that are not to do with climate, and disagreements, including major disagreements about things that are to do with climate, but nevertheless have enough in common on the question of climate to be able to genuinely work together and forge the broad consensus that is going to be required if there is to be broad, serious action that appeals to, well, a mainstream audience. One more point. As we see it in the CMP, if these objectives of a depolarized climate space and a genuinely inclusive climate space are to be achieved, it is not enough just to talk about it. You have to actually go ahead and start to make it happen. In our small way here tonight, we're helping to make it happen. So we're just delighted to be co-hosting with republicEn. We're delighted to have Bob and Amber with us in this joint event. And that's really enough from me. I want to hand over to Bob to tell us, as he sees it, what the kind of climate movement that I'm talking about that is genuinely inclusive might look like, and how these things look from the, as we say it, other side of the pond. Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you, Rupert, and thank you, Liam, for doing this. As Rupert just said, the clue is in the name, Climate Majority Project. And when I first heard from Rupert about that, I was excited to know that there was this effort going on because that's really what it's about: is creating a majority for action. Because in a polarized world, you might end up with a very unstable result, and that's what we've had so far. So this whole effort to create a climate majority is essential. So I'm glad for what you're doing, and glad to be here with you, Amber, because I think you'll have some interesting things to say that can inform us on this side of the world about what's going on elsewhere. And so I've got two of my colleagues on with us. Chelsea Henderson is on. She's our director of editorial content. I hope Chelsea will put in the chat her book that she's written about climate action called Glacial, that some of you may well be interested in. And also, we've got Angela Lark, our engagement director, who does these sort of webinars for us. So yes, there's this outlet called republicEn.org. That's EN for energy, entrepreneurship, and the environment. We're conservatives who care about climate change. That's a thing, you know. Some people might doubt that it's a thing, but it's a thing, and it's a growing thing. We got, especially among young conservatives in America, there's a sense that, well, gee, we really need to do something about this climate thing. Their parents are harder for us. Their grandparents are just hard, hard to convince. But we're happy every time we get an opportunity with young folks because they're the best ambassadors to their parents and grandparents. So I probably should explain, though, how I got to this because, it is a little bit crazy, maybe, or a little bit unexpected. What a conservative. Are you really a conservative, Inglis, or are you a rhino, Republican in name only? Well, I think I'm pretty conservative. And I, for my first 6 years in Congress, said that climate change was nonsense. All I knew is Al Gore was for it. He's a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm against it. Okay, pretty ignorant. That's the way it was, though, my first 6 years. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. Outed myself there, recovering lawyer, you understand, and a recovering politician, as you'll hear momentarily. Anyway, yeah, 6 years doing commercial real estate law again. Had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. Our son, the eldest of our 5 kids, came to me that year and he said, since he was voting for the first time, he said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. New constituency. I'm sure Amber can substantiate. You want to respond to those people. They're very important people. They can change the locks on the doors to your house. You need to respond to that constituency. So that was step one of a 3-step metamorphosis for me. Step two is going to Antarctica with a science committee, seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. We can go into that in the Q&A time if you're interested. And then because it is a pretty fascinating thing and simpler than you might think. And then third step for me was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems unlikely, right, on a godless science committee trip, because we all know that all scientists are godless. Apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist who I was snorkeling with at the Great Barrier Reef, showing me the glories of the Great Barrier Reef and the challenge of coral bleaching, I could tell was worshiping God in what he was showing me. We'd go down, he'd had some amazing lung capacity and he'd hang out down there. We'd get to the surface, I'd be heaving for air and he'd be all excited to tell me what he'd just shown me down below. And so I knew that we shared a worldview before any words were spoken, because I could see that he was worshiping God, not the corals. Because St. Francis of Assisi supposedly said, I don't know if he actually said it, but supposedly he said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." And so Scott Heron, the Aussie climate scientist who's now become a very dear friend, was doing just that. And so I knew we shared a worldview. Later, without the snorkels in our mouths, we had a chance to talk. He told me about conservation changes he was making in his life to love God and love people. People come after us. So he rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning in Townsville, Australia, as much as possible. That's a pretty hot place. Hangs the family's clothes out of the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009 into the U.S. Congress. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in midst of Great Recession when you represent perhaps the reddest district, in other words, most conservative district or the most conservative state in the country. Will not go well for you. And it did not go well at all. After 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote in the Republican runoff that year. The other guy got the other 71% of the vote. Rather spectacular faceplant in politics, and that's when a foundation came to me and said, Inglis, you're a rather unusual zoo animal, actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, National Rifle Association, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action, that's a liberal group, and 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO, the American Labor Union. I was hoping for 0, so I don't know how I got a 23. And so they said, an actual conservative who says climate change is real, will you speak and write for the proposition? So that's what I've been doing ever since. It's now this thing called republicEn.org. We say we're different. We even spell it a little bit differently. But hopefully this is going to become the view of my party. And the thing that I would encourage you is things have changed a lot since those dark days of that Great Recession. It's really pretty terrible back then. People were worried about their house being financially underwater, their jobs, banks failing. It was serious, serious troubled times. Now it's a lot better. And the impacts are more and more clear. There was a time when maybe you could sort of dispute the existence of climate change. As my friend Catherine Hayhoe likes to say, most people have stopped arguing with thermometers now because it's an argument you can't win. And so because the times are better, because the observations of climate are so much clearer, we're in a different spot now. Probably best indicated by, I think, what's happening right now in a Senate race in Utah, where a guy named John Curtis is about to win Mitt Romney's old seat in the U.S. Senate. He's into climate action. Now, there are some unique things about Utah that make it a particularly leading jurisdiction on climate. But hopefully capable people like John are going to help spread this to my party so that our spelling becomes a little bit more the flavor of the Republican Party. And so that's where I think we are. By the way, if I could just tell you, very briefly, and then we'll hand it over to Amber. In our view at republicEn.org, there are 3 ways to fix climate change. You can regulate emissions, you can incentivize clean energy, or you can do a carbon tax and apply it to imports and get the whole world in on this thing. So the first one, you can regulate emissions. Immediate problem with that, and of course, as you can imagine, as a Republican, I sort of break out in hives when you mention the word regulations. It's sort of like uncomfortable for us. But even if I weren't that way, what we tell American audiences, isn't there an obvious problem with it, which is we can't regulate Chinese emissions from here in America. They're not subject to the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So that means that, you could clean up local air. Surely I think it would work to clean up air here in America. And that'd be great. We'd have fewer asthma cases, fewer hospitalizations, longer life expectancy. Be pretty great here. But you're not solving climate change until you get the world in on it, because the devilish problem about climate change is emissions anywhere or climate change everywhere. So you literally have to get the world in on the thing. Second approach is to incentivize clean energy. And if I were still in Congress, I'd be voting for some of those things. You know, it's basically subsidies for wind and solar. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act, could be forgiven for not understanding why an act called the Inflation Reduction Act related to energy subsidies. That's a doggone good question. And I bet right now Kamala Harris wishes they'd called it the Energy Act rather than the Inflation Reduction Act. But in any event, the Inflation Reduction Act here had a number of credits in it, right, for wind and solar. And what conservative hasn't ever met a tax credit they didn't like? A tax credit is a way of reducing taxes. And so I'd be voting for some of those things, and probably a lot of Republicans would too. But here's the little problem with that. It's sort of like the same problem as a regulatory approach. Is those tax incentives only work if you pay American taxes. If you don't pay American taxes, the credits are worthless to you, Chinese corporation. And so you haven't affected their economics. And so what you may end up with is better air here in America through those tax credits, but not solving climate change. And so obviously I favor the third approach, now having politely dissed the regulatory approach and the clean incentives approach, is to just put a price on carbon dioxide. Do a carbon tax. Yes, that's a conservative talking about a new tax, but it's paired with a reduction in existing taxes. The one I'd pick is the payroll tax, which is a tax that we pay here in America on wage income. You reduce that tax, you put on the carbon tax. The Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans would be made better off because they'd have a fuller paycheck. They would have higher energy costs, you know, but you can do things about that. Turn down the thermostat, put plastic on the windows in the winter, drive less. You can do things to avoid the payroll tax, to avoid the carbon tax, but you can't do anything to avoid the payroll tax. And so that's step one, is to make it what's called revenue neutral. So you cut taxes somewhere else, equal amount. So now you're not growing government. And then the second key thing that makes it so much better than the regulatory and the clean energy approach is to do a carbon border adjustment mechanism to apply the tax to imports. And that would make it in the interest of our trading partners to do the same thing. Because why pay a carbon tax on entry of your goods to America, a very desirable market for people to enter with their products, when you're going to have to pay the tax going in there that you could have paid to your home country? So at that point, people figure out in other countries that, gee, why don't we do the same thing? We'd rather have the tax money here than fork it over to the Americans. And so then you get the whole world in on it. And 8 billion people start seeing the true cost of burning fossil fuels because it's built into the price of everything. And the example I'd conclude with and hand it off to Amber is, you know, you go to the grocery store after we've done this carbon tax, and you got that fuller paycheck in your pocket here in America because we untax your payroll income a little bit. And last week you were choosing plates for an event that you were going to. Now you got another event to go to, but the carbon tax just been put on. And now you go to that shelf in the store where they're selling plates, and you see the paper plates and you see the plastic plates. Whoa, the plastic plate has gone up in price. The paper plate went up a little bit because we did this carbon tax, and there's chainsaw gas and there's natural gas at the paper mill to dry the paper. So the paper plate's up a little bit in price, but the plastic plate, wow. It's all petroleum, all natural gas, all the time. And you're looking at that with your fuller paycheck in your pocket, and you're thinking, which am I going to get for this event? Well, if you just love plastic, we're for freedom at republicEn.org, and go ahead and buy the plastic if you want to. But if you're cheap like me, you're going to pick the paper. And when you pick the paper, probably a lot of other people can do the same. And the result is that's going to happen on every shelf in the store. Because on every shelf, there's going to be a new competitor to the dirty that's been made accountable. And the clean is looking relatively cheaper compared to that dirty made accountable. And that's the power of free enterprise innovation that can deliver a solution to climate change at speed and scale. That's our story. That's our song at republicEn.org. Give me an amen. I'll stop preaching and hand it over to Amber, I suppose.
Yes, thank you very much, Bob. Really inspiring. And I have good news for you that the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as the EU calls it, is coming in. And it is exactly what you've described, really, and with the hope that why would China pay that tax? Instead, they will adjust in order not to pay it. There are, of course, wider problems with other countries, but as a principle, I think it's been accepted over here, and the UK will probably follow the EU. I was very taken by your story about what you called your facepalm. And it reminds me, and it's just important for everybody who haven't been in politics to understand this, is that you can't ask politicians to do things that won't get them re-elected. And you had that experience. And when people say to me, well, not anymore, rather like you, Bob, now I'm out of government, I find it much easier to find solutions. But when you're in government, when people say, well, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just do that? You can't run much faster than the voters because two things happen. One, you get voted out. And secondly, they don't believe you. And so you actually help, I think, the climate deniers, of which there are now very few. I mean, even the people who oppose climate action find different ways of approaching it. I think from a political point of view, the other sort of attack I used to get was, why can't you politicians work together? This is a global issue. And there was a time in the UK when we did work together. I mean, in the UK, we had the Climate Change Act of 2008. And in fact, it was the Conservatives that pushed Labour to go even further. And it's been pretty effective in terms of holding governments to account with carbon budgets. It's not one of those things where you say net zero by 2050. This is like regular budget. Secretary of State has to go into Parliament, and both three MPs out of 650 in 2008 voted against it. So it was sort of total political consensus, and that lasted for a while. And when I was Secretary of State, we did something quite bold, which took some persuading of the Prime Minister at the time, which was to put an end on coal-fired power stations. And just 2 weeks ago, we had the first final closing of the last one. And of course, that's been fantastic for reducing our emissions. Some people would say it's the easy bit, but it's been a significant bit. I think that when politicians talk about climate action and the alternatives and the solutions that we have and the solutions that we don't have, I think it's one of those things where it's complicated, and we have to take the voters, the population, our stakeholders with us by impressing upon them that there are complications. It's not just do this, find a solution there. It is those issues that we know about of cost, of the emissions, and of security, particularly in a world where there are wars on Europe's border, where Russia's no longer producing gas that we want. All these issues mean that energy has become even more complicated than it was. But I do think there is good news out of that, which is, the truth is, if we just do get less dependent on fossil fuels and manage to ramp up our renewables, we will be less dependent on other countries which we do not want to be dependent on, and we will reduce carbon emissions. However, I do worry, and I feel we're experiencing this in the UK, that it's all made to sound too simple, that there's no honesty about plastic plates, about the content, about why we need oil and gas for PPE in our hospitals. It's too absolutist. And this is why I appreciate the climate majority and Rupert and Liam's efforts to broaden it, because I feel there ought to be space for people who have different views, who want to talk about the solutions, but who don't feel that it's all one or all the other, who want to face up to the complications, who want to look at the costs, who's going to take the costs of the investment we're going to need for the renewables or for the nuclear, and not just pretend if we do all one thing, we'll find the solution. So I would call for, apart from, an excellent solution like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, more honesty and truthfulness about the costs, and therefore a discussion about who's going to pay it, not sort of just pretend it's not there, and some honesty about the fact that currently we still need fossil fuel and how we're going to reduce that without becoming dependent on other people, not by just shutting off the taps. And I hope that the climate majority can help to be a forum for some of those trickier elements of the discussion that is somewhere between the climate deniers and people throwing tomato soup on the Van Gogh. Thank you.
Liam, I think that's your cue.
Great. So I think a great way of starting off our response to that is just to outline number one reason I'd say that we want to be able to include conservatives is because the majority of people out there, I think, are a depolarization majority. If we actually want to make a difference in climate change, and if we want to get past the types of dynamics that have dominated US politics, the majority of folks out there really want to see a more depolarized dialogue. They want to see a return to civility. Now, even people who are voting for Donald Trump, right? People are anti-establishment, they want to see change, and they're willing to deal with people who are polarizing to get change. But if you actually look at polls of what people see as the biggest problem in the political system, why things aren't happening, the number one response in kind of Pew polls, major polls of the US public even, is that there's an enormously polarized environment. So if you can actually include diverse political voices in one conversation and then address the kinds of questions like who's actually going to pay for this? There's so many different plans out there. There's a lot of different contentious. When we actually get down to brass tacks, we're going to need to have a very good depolarizing conversation. If we can't even include conservative voices who are pro-carbon tax at the start, and then we're going to get down to brass tacks about who's going to pay for things, and sort of good luck, right? I think that's the minimum challenge. Let's be able to include people like Martin Wolf, right? People like 28 Nobel laureate economists, not particularly a highly liberal profession, 4,000 economists who signed a letter back in 2019 that I think Bob was involved in. So there's enormous support among the business community in a lot of ways. People are not as vocal as they probably should be. But if you look at polls of business leaders, there's an enormous realization that much more regulation is needed among business leaders. So we need to be able to include those voices. And if we can include everybody and speak to the interests that most people have, then I think we can have a much different and much more pragmatic conversation that will include a lot more people. I think I'll just follow up on some other points that people might not be talking about as much. As, first of all, climate change is a national security issue. We're still talking about green growth. In a lot of ways, cost of living 2 years ago was really what people are talking about. That's probably not going away. Conserving what you have, the conservative frame of let's talk about conserving what we have, let's talk about stability, is only going to get in many ways more powerful in a chaotic world. We should really learn how to speak that way because it matters to most people. Again, if you actually look at like Frank Luntz's analysis of why is Donald Trump doing so well, a lot of what he's doing effectively is speaking people's language about economic security, about protecting what they have. And that is language that could be spoken effectively by people concerned about climate change. We're not doing it right now. I think our friends here could help with that. So what we're also talking about here is a genuine need to learn from the skills and ideas of people on the other side of the political spectrum, not just to convince them, but to say, well, what can we learn from the way they think, the way they do things? It's also important to remember that conservatism is not a Western phenomenon. India's government, 1.2 billion, people in India. I think the Modi government probably qualifies as conservative. And very much, if we want to speak to governments worldwide, we should learn how to think and imagine things from a conservative frame. Also, self-interest in general. I think that's something that we probably should also pick up on as adaptation. That right now, at this point, the climate change conversation is changing, and that adaptation is at the top of the agenda. For years we've been talking about, at least implicitly, we've been talking about making 1.5 increasingly. Like a year ago, economists declared 1.5 gone on its cover. More and more people are realizing that goal is not going to happen, and that means that there's consequences. There are changes to be made. So people can locally start to prepare for inevitable consequences. And as soon as you start thinking about inevitable local consequences, then one realizes that we can't do it all alone locally. So there's a way of including both mitigation and self-interest, right? And I'd say this is kind of, some progressives in the audience might get a little bit I don't know, surety with me for saying this, but there's kind of two kinds of people in the world: those who care more about themselves and their friends and family than others and admit it, and those who care more about themselves, their friends, and their families and don't admit it. And many of the people who admit it tend to be conservatives. But if you learn to speak in terms of self-interest, then you can appeal to everybody. And particularly adaptation language starts doing that. It's not to say we don't care about everybody else, but pretty much most people do actually care more about their friends and family and themselves. And so moving towards this kind of adaptation framing is what we should be doing. And I think that would bring a lot more people into the climate fold and help to include conservative audiences as well. And also really, the more that we talk about that, we can kind of break this kind of taboo on that, because there's a kind of need to constantly be more morally pure than other people in the climate action milieu, and I think that's part of what we'd like to do as well, is challenge that, right? Open up the conversation and try to include everybody's interest. How can we make a global pact around this? Because as Bob and Amber have alluded to, it's in everybody's interest all across the globe, and that's part of what the point we have to make. Everybody has an interest in this. Everybody's values, however we think about them, include making a pact around this. So what are those interests, right? We have to include all voices to really have that conversation. When we imagine ourselves being able to include those voices, then actually hope gets a lot more realistic. The idea of climate action gets to be a lot more probable. So I think we need a lot more faith in our ability to include voices and to depolarize. And that's another thing. One last thing is, studies do show right now, we've had a few hurricanes go through the United States. There's a lot of stuff on the news about do people actually change their opinions in response to those extreme weather events? Yes, they normally do, except in highly polarized environments. So one of the few things that we can really do as an organized climate movement, or the most important things, is to bring down the temperature, pun intended, in the public conversation. And the more we can depolarize the public conversation, we might actually allow the weather to do its work in making climate converts out of people. So that's another reason for this type of dialogue.
Liam, thanks so much, and thanks for mentioning the great importance that we in the Climate Majority Project place on adaptation. I'll be leading our Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience campaign starting very shortly, that abbreviates conveniently to SAFER, which is what we will all become if we get serious now on adaptation. You heard it here first. Amber, over to you. Is there something you would like to ask of one or more of our fellow panelists?
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on something Liam said, then ask Bob something, if I may.
Yeah.
Which is that, Liam, when I'm looking for hope, I tell people that when we at Paris in 2015, the expectation was that the climate was going to increase by possibly 4 degrees. And even though 1.5 is too far, too ambitious, it feels, and 2 may yet be as well. It is not as bad as it could be. So it shows that we can make changes that will affect, if we can only make more of them and better, then we'll have a better chance. But I think that shows that we're not powerless, is my view. Bob, I wanted to ask you, particularly in the light of your description of the tribalism of the parties, what's going on with the election in terms of climate action? We've all seen the Inflation Reduction Act. We've also seen the scale of the annual fires and the hurricanes, the scale of disruptions. Do you feel, what is going on by the voters? Are they more convinced? And is it impacting at all how they vote?
Presumably there is an impact, but it's not being mentioned by either of the candidates so much. Neither of them are talking about climate, except when Donald Trump says it's a hoax or something. But and Kamala Harris may at times answer the question saying, "Oh yes, we need to do something about climate," but it's certainly not a rallying cry of this election. The election is, to what Lim was just saying, it's all about inflation and immigration, I think, and it's always frustrating to us in the climate space, isn't it, when the political salience of our issue is always down the list. It seems that it's always that economy thing, but I think Lim had the right analysis there about that's what we all care about. And it has to be made real to us. And so climate is being made real to us. I agree that in a polarized world, though, it's sort of hard to accept that because you're afraid that you're going to be cut off from your tribe. And human beings need the protection of their tribe. None of us can survive alone in this very dangerous world. We really need the protection of the tribe. And so people don't want to be cut off from the tribe. That's not just politicians, that's the constituents. And so that's the challenge, is to make sure that we realize really we're all in this together, literally. It's a little bit odd that this election, it's a crucial issue facing the whole world, and it's not being much discussed in the American presidential race.
Mm-hmm. Liam, any quick response to what Amber said?
Well, I agree. I think I just to respond to both. I think one thing we're actually missing here in terms of hope is also that younger conservatives are very climate concerned. I don't think we actually focused on that, but if you look at young Republican voters, they do actually have climate change high up on their priorities, right? Say people who are Trump leaning or traditionally Republican leaning and below 35. So that's another thing that we can be pointing out, is that for up and coming conservative politicians, or the future of conservative parties across the world, it is an issue with the future. So
yeah, I think, Lim, I think you're right, because I think they plan on living on the planet for a while. And so they join young progressives in wanting an answer to climate change. I found that recently, several months ago, I was at the Treasure Coast Young Republican Club. It's about 50 miles north of Mar-a-Lago, President Trump's residence. And so I went there with some trepidation, realizing it's probably going to be a MAGA rally. They were all from Trump, of course, but they were also for climate action. And they were very open to the message that I was bringing to them about simply pricing in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels. So it went pretty well. That's because they're young and they're, like I say, planning on living on the planet for a while.
Mm-hmm. Amber, anything you want to pick up from the other panelists in terms of responding?
No, I think that's it. I see that I was just looking at the chat, Rupert, and I see Laurie Moulton Ulrich has put in something about the Climate Change Act not really being fit for purpose anymore, and a new piece of legislation may be coming through, which is stressing the protection of nature. And I do think that's interesting, which is that since I was involved in government, and particularly in this department 10 years ago, in the climate change department, the emphasis wasn't so much on nature and biodiversity, and the loss of nature and biodiversity, which has been a much more tangible thing, I feel, for the public to engage with, has successfully corralled people around the need for change. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Very good. Let's start to segue into the Q&A part of our evening. People have started putting questions in the chat. Please continue to do so. And we will take questions from the chat, although we're also willing to take questions verbally if people want to deliver them that way. Let's start with the question from Eddie here. I'll read it out. Do we need to tackle what seems to be the dominant narrative that the future will be pretty much like the present, only electrified? I.e., do we need to start saying that real changes, sacrifices, will be necessary? Who would like to handle that one?
Nobody who wants to get elected to high office.
Yeah, that's well. I will tell you that's true, Amber. But you know, we're sort of guilty at republicEn.org of a eat your vegetables message. You know, because we come along and we say, yeah, we need to price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels. We need a carbon tax. We do want to pair it with a reduction in payroll taxes or dividend the money back to the citizenry so there's no growth of government. And we want to apply it to imports. So that is an eat your vegetables message. That's the challenge. Because, you know, when other people are saying, here's some bonbons, wouldn't you rather sit on the couch and have those? It's a challenge. But I do have the hope that when people come to realize that they've got a problem that they need a solution to, eventually you come to know that people have been selling you a bill of goods, and they haven't been solving your problem. And when that happens, big changes happen in the political system. Then you can get a realignment year, for example. I'm not a political science, but I majored in political science in college, you know, and so there's certain realignment years. And I think climate could cause a realignment if my party isn't careful, because you could lose a lot of people once they come to the realization that, gee, this thing is obviously real, and we want a solution. So give us a solution, one that works. But I do concede that takes leadership, and the challenge in politics is most politicians follow, they don't lead.
Yes.
It's a rare politician who actually leads.
Yeah, I mean, part of our idea in the Climate Majority Project is precisely to try to create the momentum such that politicians don't have to lead so far, as it were. In other words, there'll be a lot more people kind of making it easier for them. But can I add to what you've said, Bob, by going back to Amber and asking, what about if people get serious about the adaptation agenda, and by talking about protection, including protection against otherwise coming and inevitable losses, and also what about the Churchillian precedent in a situation of obviously dire national peril? It's very striking, isn't it, that Churchill didn't say, follow me and everything is going to be fine. He said, I can only promise you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Is there something there that can be built on?
Yes, I mean, I've heard people sort of answer this question by saying there will be a catastrophic event and everything will change. But I find that too depressing a thought. I do think that I mean, electrifying is a large part of the future. I had thought sort of 15, 20 years ago that it would inevitably lead us to using less electricity because of smart grids, cost effectiveness. All those changes should be leading to less usage. But of course, that's not the case. ChatGPT uses 9 times as much as going on Google. Data centers are just consuming more energy and water than anybody anticipated at this stage. And I don't know what the answer is to try to rein in the use of electricity.
Yes. Let's turn to another question, which I'd like to put directly to both Amber and Bob. So Karen Jack asks, what kind of language should we avoid using if we want to ensure we appeal to conservative-leaning people? What kind of language should we avoid using to appeal to conservatives?
Well, I think that what sort of put a lot of my colleagues off, and I talk about the Climate Change Act in 2008 because it was an extraordinary moment in time where the Conservatives were as ambitious as Labour, and of course David Cameron, he went off to the Arctic and felt very strongly about. In fact, he was think green, vote blue, Bob being Conservative. So, and Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister at the time. So I said, think green, vote blue, ditch brown, choose amber. And it worked for me in 2010. But at that point, the Conservatives were very sort of leading edge on trying to address climate action, but it swung away. What can I say? I think it's not a coincidence that we've got a sort of populist party now in the UK with Nigel Farage basically rubbishing the need for climate action, great friends with Trump. They're on the sort of same playbook from that point of view. And I do worry that the Conservative Party swung too far. And so to keep both parties together, I think that there has to be less of an easy hit with saying you don't want to do this climate action, it's too expensive. I think it's the cost. But I also think, as Liam was talking about the security, and I would take that, it's security for a country as well as security of actual supply. So I think I would be making much more of those tangible examples of what it means to people in the country. It's not going to increase the cost of your bills. It will increase the cost of someone else's bills, but it's not going to have a general cost. And it makes us more secure in a dangerous world. So I think that's the sort of language. I think it's too easy for politicians to say, I'm on your side, I want lower bills, because as we've been sort of coming around the cost of living crisis, people will always choose to put shoes on their children rather than the long-term addressing climate change.
Bob, do you have a view on this? And then we'll go to Liam.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of words to avoid, I think, in when presenting to conservatives. One is probably talk about the risk. Don't talk about the crisis. In other words, just don't be the person with your hair on fire. That doesn't work. If you're in a burning theater, you want some calm person to say, "This way to the exits," rather than somebody screaming, "We're all going to die," because it just doesn't help us if you're just screaming that. And so remain calm, I guess, is the thing, sort of, yeah, that's that slogan that I guess back to that Churchillian time, right? But anyway, so just remain calm. And also, this may sound a little bit strange, but realize that the conservative you're talking to may have an undeserved inferiority complex. They may think they're no good at energy and climate because they're not used to talking about it. And so they shrink in science denial because they feel uncomfortable. It's so like, somebody asked me constantly about running in a marathon. Are you kidding me? I've stood at the finish line of those things. People look like they're dying coming across those finish line. I don't want to do that. But, so I changed the subject, right? And so that's what conservatives do when the topic of climate comes up. And so just realize you may be talking to somebody that needs to be sort of, bucked up a little bit about how, oh no, you're really good. You're like the people that understand economics. You're like the people who understand that what we have here is an unrecognized negative externality. Actually, don't say that. My ad guy says, Bob, don't ever use those words because nobody understands what you're talking about. Side effects, that works. Just talk to them about, we got some side effects that we're not paying for. If we just bring accountability for those, it'll work out. And then that plays to their strength. It makes them feel like, hey, I got something to offer here. I'm not about to be canceled. The world isn't moving on without me. I'm part of this future. And so it's, that's what I'd say. Recognize you may have an undeserved inferiority complex on your hands.
Very good. Liam.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the other thing is to band together and build credibility because politicians don't move opinion. If you look at like who are the most trusted people, it's not particularly politicians, right? It's thought leaders. So, but people banding together and saying reasonable things for a long time and allowing events to prove us right is the way to eventually get ahead of this, right? So I'd say to kind of echo Bob as well, that remain calm, point out solutions, talk about the ability to unify the climate majority, keep on, talking and walking the depolarizing walk. And as Amber said, don't minimize the difficulty of things, right? This is part of the problem is that, this kind of overly hopeful economic messaging maybe seem motivating in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't really give us credibility. So it's probably not the job of people in elected office to build that credibility. It's the job of organizations like this one and republicEn to say the right thing for a long time until events eventually prove us right, like Churchill was.
Yes, yes. We have Bill Hurley, who's been waiting patiently to ask a question verbally. Bill, will you please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask whoever you wish your question? Bill, are you doing that? No. Have we lost Bill? Okay. We will, in that case, move on.
I'm sorry. Here we are.
There you are. Go.
All right. Appreciate everything that's been said, and I think that this is a real important topic in Texas, especially where I live. Bob appeals to human nature better than anybody I've ever heard on our side. And human nature is what's missing in our standard message. In my experience, when we say clean air or dirty skies, that is a bad thing to conservatives because they believe that they look up and they see a blue sky and they remember, especially if they're my age, they remember that it used to be real smoggy. Well, that's dirty air. That's not the same thing. In the last two presidential debates, the Republicans said, I believe in clean air. And that just gripes me because greenhouse gases is transparent. Methane is transparent. It's global, not local. There's a whole lot of hosted differences. So when we appeal to clean air, that's not going to work. The other thing I have, and this might be very contentious, is that we also say it's human caused. Well, I agree with that it is human caused, but isn't that putting the blame? Isn't that pointing the finger of blame at somebody and saying, it's your fault? And so they turn off very often, in my experience, when they hear that I'm on the climate activity doing something. And they say, oh, you're another one that's just blaming industry, like pitchforkers in France.
Interesting. Thanks, Bill. I think that's the question for you, Bob.
Yeah, well, good to hear from you, Bill. You'll see soon a piece that I'm describing exactly a response to that in full about how to introduce a language of redemption, basically, because what you're on there right at the end is this idea that there's guilt. And guilt without the hope of redemption brings paralysis. But if you have the hope of redemption, then you can act. But if you're just going to tell me that I'm guilty, well, then I'm going to fight that accusation, and it is to that human nature point that you're making, that's the that's not a winning approach. We got to realize we're all complicit in this. You know, we've all enjoyed driving on BP's gas or Exxon's gas. You know, it gets us places. And it's so we've got to somehow introduce the hope of redemption and use that kind of language, because I think you're exactly right, Bill. It's a lot about it's just human nature, and it's about the heart, not the head. The head would clear up very quickly if we get through the heart blockage. The heart is where the problem is. And it's that sense that, wait a minute, my people don't talk about this, that's the other people. And if I talk about it, I'm going to be cut off from my tribe. So I'll just hunker down with my people and we don't talk about climate. That's a heart decision. If you could just get through that and get into the head, I'm convinced that this revenue neutral border adjustable carbon tax is something that both the liberal and the conservative head would say, oh yeah, that's pretty obvious.
And what's interesting about that, of course, is that if you're right, Bob, then you, by definition, pretty much have something which genuinely does appeal to the majority. You've actually got then a climate majority, and that's getting pretty exciting if we're in that territory.
Yeah.
Can
Amber? Yes.
I would say that I think that carbon emission crisis has to be caused by humans. But the fact that we say it is I don't think puts people off, because in my experience, it makes them think, well, then we can fix it. If they feel it's something that's done to them by things other than human activity, it's like, well, you know, the dinosaurs, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's like, because we caused it, because of all the stuff that we have done, we just need to change the way we do it. We can fix this thing. I think it's a much more.
But Amber, I'm sorry, but we can. We can't fix a tornado. We didn't cause a tornado, but we could go into the underground. And also the inverse is true. If we did cause something, we sometimes can't fix it. You can't fix a bullet when you should fire a gun.
That is true.
Thanks for your question, Bill. And we're moving on to the next question. And we're coming towards the end. This is a question specifically for Amber. What is your view on the two candidates running for the Conservative Party leadership with regard to climate action? Here you are, Amber, being put on the spot. You might have guessed this one would come. If climate is your high concern, given the risk to our children's future, but one nation conservatism is one's natural political home, is it possible to vote Conservative in the foreseeable future?
Well, every time Bob talked about young Republicans, I winced slightly, because there aren't many young Conservatives. The average age that people start voting Conservative, which used to be about 35 or 40, has now gone, I mean, it's shockingly high. We've managed, as a political party, to put them off by sheer appalling behaviour over the past 5 years. Neither of these two, you have to have some sympathy for politicians, please. They have to face towards their electorate. And the electorate for these two is, I believe, less than 100,000 people spread across the UK who are Conservative Party members. And most of them are in the southeast, southwest. Very few of them are under 45, 50. Most of them, I would say the average age is probably 60, 65, possibly higher. The Conservative Party is not keen to release information about that. So when you talk, Bob, about the difficulty with people of an elderly disposition, have some sympathy for these two. Their electorate is elderly, very right-wing, and a small band. So it is not surprising that neither of them are talking about this. And if they are, it is not helpfully. So it is difficult to find any sort of positive lines from either of the two new Conservative leaders. But all I can say is that if they want to be contenders at the next general election, let alone the one after that, they will have to get back talking about this and find some proper policies. And having a climate majority and Conservatives like myself who are going to hold them to account for that, I think we have a job to do.
Yeah. Folks, we are nearly out of time. I'm going to go back to our three speakers and ask if there is anything they would like to say by way of a short final summing up. Apologies for the several questions that we haven't got to, but any final thoughts either on the issue itself or in the debate as it's unfolded tonight, or on the event? Bob, I'll come to you first.
Just this, I'm certain that we're going to act on climate change. The only question is whether we act soon enough. And so we will, Churchill has been mentioned here several times, and there's a quote that's attributed to him. I'm not sure it's accurate, but every American politician uses it, is you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. I'm not sure that Churchill actually said it, but we love to quote him to that effect. And I'm certain we're going to act on climate. It's just whether we act soon enough.
Liam, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just thanks to the speakers, and I think this depolarizing dialogue that we had today is something we need to keep on with. There's a lot of, I was just looking at Ruth's comments in the chats about the idea that we can adapt our way out of it. Of course we cannot. That's the type of question that we need to get into in more detail. On the other hand, adaptation will also certainly be part of it, even if we mitigate as best as we can. So sorry if there's some confusion on that, but those are the types of difficult questions that we need a very depolarized environment to talk about sensibly.
Brilliant. And Amber, a last word?
There have been some extraordinary breakthroughs in clean energy. The price of solar, nobody anticipated it to fall like it has. There's further breakthroughs coming the whole time in long duration storage and in batteries. So I think there's room for optimism. But ultimately, I share Bob's view that we are changing the climate. We are making progress, particularly from Paris in 2015, since it has been properly mapped since then. But it's a question of speed now, and we need all hands to the pump to make sure we get there.
We've had just an hour together tonight, folks, but we've crammed a lot into that. This event was an experiment. It seems to me it's already proven to be a successful experiment. There will be a video of it available afterwards. Let's get that going far and wide. And I'm hoping that we'll continue the conversation, and that I think we should think about having some kind of follow-up event next year after a lot of dust that's about to be thrown up into the atmosphere, as it were, has settled, and think about what the way forward on this is somewhat more, because this has been an exciting and encouraging event, albeit in a very difficult time and on an extremely difficult topic. Just before we fold for tonight, I'll hand over to Yajia, our operations manager, for a moment to tell us about the next Climate Majority Project webinar.
Indeed. I was just going to announce these in the chat, but on November 4th and the 12th, October 29th and November 12th, we're having pre and post-election webinars with authors Chantal Burns and Stephen Markley about fostering resilience regardless of the outcome of the election in the United States, which is on everyone's mind. And also Stephen's kind of post-election interpretation of how to respond to whatever comes about. And these will both happen at 6:30 p.m. UK, and details will be sent out on CMP channels, both on social media and the newsletter tomorrow, for anyone to sign up for free.
Yes, thanks, Yajia. And obviously there will be, as Yajia implied there, a resilience building and adaptation dimension to both of those discussions very strongly. Thanks everyone for coming this evening. Thanks once again to our fabulous speakers, and well, dare I say, good luck for our friends across the pond, whatever exactly that means. One thing apparently it may mean is a great deal of interest in the results of the senatorial race in Utah. So we will definitely have some eyes on that. Thank you for that important datum. Good night, everybody, and thanks so much.
Bob and Liam, thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you.
See you all.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.